All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. And today, we're going to be talking about something pretty crucial for anyone in the hospitality industry,
Yeah.
especially if you're, a hotel owner or a restaurant owner.
hmm
Um, and that is what's coming down the pipeline as far as culinary trends for 2025.
Yeah, definitely. And, this is something that anyone in the food and beverage world is thinking about, the future of food, what's going to be hot, what's going to be not, and all of that. So,
Right. And what's interesting is we've been looking into some insights from someone named Maurice, who's an hospitality professional, really strong background in food and beverage management and sales.
okay.
And his perspective is really geared towards, the hotel and restaurant owners out there.
So he's speaking directly to our audience.
Yeah, exactly. And what I found really interesting is he's not talking about, throwing everything out the window and starting fresh.
Yeah.
It's more about how to intelligently blend, what we already know works
hmm
with these new exciting developments that are coming, down the pipeline.
It's about keeping your menu fresh, keeping things exciting, for the diners.
Yeah, and, being able to adapt to what customers want,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And I think that's a crucial point that Maurice really brings up is this idea that 2025 isn't about a revolution, it's about an evolution.
So,
It's taking what we already have and building on it in a way that makes sense for both the business and the customers.
so where do we see, like, that tradition and innovation kind of coming together? Like, where do they meet?
Well, one of the areas that Maurice talks about that I think is super interesting is this whole um, emergence of insect protein.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he gives this example of a French startup called Insect,
Okay.
and they're basically taking insects and transforming them into food for both humans and animals. And now I know that might sound a little strange to some people, but
Yeah.
the point here is not necessarily that we're all going to be eating, whole crickets or anything like that. Right.
It's about how these new sustainable protein sources
Mm.
are going to start to integrate into our diets in maybe more subtle ways.
So like insect flour or something like that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You could have insect flour that's being used to boost the protein content of a dish, or, maybe even things like cricket powder being added to things like energy bars or other types of product.
Okay, so it's not a total overhaul of the menu. It's about finding creative ways to incorporate these new ingredients.
Yeah. And I think what's really key for our listeners to understand is that this is just one example
Right.
of how innovation is going to start to play a role in the way we think about food. And what's really important for you as a hotel or restaurant owner is to be aware of these trends
Yeah.
and be open to experimenting and seeing how you can adapt and evolve your menu to stay ahead of the curve.
Mm. So being adaptable is really, really key here, it seems like.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that Maurice really emphasizes is this idea of diversity.
In your offerings, right?
Yeah.
Because, your customers are no longer this kind of monolithic group.
Right.
They're coming to you with all sorts of different dietary needs and preferences.
Right. Everyone's got a different diet fad now.
Exactly. You've got people who are vegan, you've got people who are gluten-free,
Yeah.
you've got people who are paleo, keto, all of these different things. And so it's really about being able to cater to that wide range of needs and really making sure that you're offering something for everyone.
Okay. So it's like future-proofing your menu in a way.
Exactly. You want to make sure that you're not going to be left behind as these trends evolve and as consumer preferences change.
Now, one trend I've been hearing a lot about lately is the rise of self-produced food.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And Maurice talks about this quite a bit in his insights. And it's interesting because it's not just a fringe movement anymore. It's becoming increasingly mainstream.
Well, especially I feel like post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think the pandemic definitely had an impact. People were stuck at home. They were looking for ways to be more self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And they were also looking for ways to connect with their food more, to know where it was coming from, to have more control over what they were eating.
So what does that look like specifically? I mean, are we talking about everyone having like a backyard farm now, or?
Well, it can take many different forms. It could be something as simple as a small herb garden on your windowsill,
Okay.
or it could be something more elaborate, like, a full-fledged vegetable garden in your backyard, or even joining a community garden.
Right.
Or we're even seeing things like these hydroponic systems becoming increasingly popular,
Yeah, I've seen those.
where people are growing food indoors in these kind of controlled environments.
Yeah, and there's that company AeroFarms, I think, that's doing that on a larger scale.
Yeah. AeroFarms is a great example. They're using hydroponics to grow food in urban environments. And they're really kind of leading the way in terms of showing how you can grow food sustainably and efficiently in these kinds of settings.
Now, what I'm wondering is, for a restaurant owner, what does this trend mean for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, obviously not every restaurant is going to have the space or the resources to start their own farm.
Right.
But there are still ways to tap into this trend. And I think one of the things that Maurice suggests is to think about incorporating elements of self-produced food into your restaurant.
Okay, so how would they do that?
Well, imagine, for example, a restaurant that has a small indoor herb garden
Okay.
where they're growing their own fresh herbs for their dishes.
Okay.
Or maybe they have a partnership with a local farm
Oh, that's nice.
where they're sourcing some of their produce directly.
Yeah, yeah.
These are all ways to kind of connect with that desire for fresh local ingredients and to show your customers that you're committed to sustainability and to supporting local businesses.
Yeah. And I feel like it also gives you a story to tell, right?
Yeah.
Like when the waiter comes over and you can be like, oh, yeah, by the way, we grow all these herbs in-house.
Exactly. It creates an experience.
Yeah.
It's not just about the food anymore. It's about the whole dining experience.
Yeah.
And so by incorporating these elements, you can really create a more unique and memorable experience for your customers.
Now, something else that's really interesting and I think kind of mind-blowing, honestly, that he talks about is this thing he calls the technological revolution in e-restoration.
Oh, yeah. That's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. It is. But I feel like it's so much more than just, like online ordering and, delivery apps and things like that.
Yeah, he's using that term e-restoration to really encompass the whole integration of technology into the entire dining experience.
So is he talking about like robot chefs and stuff like that?
Well, that's one example. We're already starting to see restaurants experimenting with robot chefs
Yeah.
who can prepare dishes, with incredible precision and consistency.
Wow. So it's like a whole different level of consistency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about human error anymore. The robot chef is going to follow the recipe perfectly every time.
Wow.
But it goes beyond just robot chefs. There's also things like predictive algorithms that can be used to forecast demand and optimize inventory.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, essentially, these algorithms can analyze data like past sales, weather patterns, and even social media trends
Oh, wow.
to predict what dishes are going to be popular on a given day.
That's amazing.
And that allows restaurants to order the right amount of ingredients, to avoid waste and to make sure that they're always stocked with the items that their customers want.
Wow. And I've also heard about like interactive augmented reality menus.
Oh, yeah. Those are really cool. And Maurice talks about those as well. Imagine a customer being able to hold their phone up to the menu and see a 3D rendering of the dish.
That would be so cool.
Or get detailed information about the ingredients or the sourcing, or even watch a video of the chef preparing the dish.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing.
It really kind of takes the whole dining experience to a whole other level.
So for someone who's like a restaurant owner listening to this, how do they even begin to think about like incorporating all this technology? It just seems like a lot.
Well, I think the key is to not get overwhelmed. It's not about trying to do everything all at once. It's about being strategic and thinking about what technologies are going to make the most sense for your business and your customers.
So it's got to be purposeful, not just like, for the sake of having the latest gadget.
Exactly. You don't want to just implement technology for the sake of technology. It has to have a purpose. It has to enhance the customer experience or improve your operations in some way.
So what's a good example of that?
Well, one example that Maurice mentions is using interactive screens to tell the story of your ingredients.
Okay.
Imagine having a screen in your restaurant where customers can learn about where your food comes from,
That's cool.
how it's prepared, meet the farmers or the producers behind the ingredients.
That's awesome.
It's a really great way to create transparency and to connect with your customers on a deeper level.
Yeah, that's really neat. I like that idea a lot now. Let's talk about protein. It seems like things are changing rapidly in the protein world.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Maurice talks about this quite a bit in his insights, and he calls it shifting perspectives on protein management.
Okay.
And it's really about how consumers are becoming increasingly aware of the impact of their protein choices,
Right.
Both on their health, on the environment, and on animal welfare.
Yeah, and we're seeing like huge brands like Beyond Meat and Corn like really exploding right now.
Exactly. Those are great examples of how the market is responding to this shift in consumer demand.
So is steak off the menu now, or like what's the situation?
Well, it's not necessarily about eliminating meat altogether. It's about offering more diverse options
Yeah.
and about positioning meat as one option among many.
So like instead of steak, it's like steak or, you know.
Exactly. You might have a menu that features a steak dish, but you also have a chickpea steak dish or a mushroom steak dish
That's cool.
or a seaweed protein quiche. It's about
Yeah.
being creative and coming up with delicious alternatives that appeal to a wide range of dietary
So it's
preferences.
not just like the sad veggie burger anymore, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Vegetarian and vegan food has come a long way, and there are so many amazing options out there now.
Yeah. And I think people are really starting to get that it's not just about, like tofu and lettuce anymore.
Right. It's about flavor. It's about texture. It's about creating dishes that are just as satisfying and delicious as any meat-based dish.
No. Speaking of like really interesting flavors, Maurice also talks about the revival of fermentation, and I've definitely noticed that.
Oh, yeah. Fermentation is huge right now. And Maurice attributes this to a couple of things. One is this growing demand for authenticity and naturalness in food. People are moving away from processed foods, and they're looking for foods that are made with real ingredients and that have a story behind them.
So it's kind of like a back to basics movement almost.
Yeah, in a way. And fermentation is a really great example of that because it's a very traditional method of preserving food.
Right.
It's been around for centuries and it's really about using natural processes to create flavor and to enhance the nutritional value of food.
So what are some examples of that besides like the obvious, kombucha and sauerkraut?
Well, those are great examples, but there's also things like kimchi miso tempeh,
Mhm.
all sorts of different fermented products that are becoming increasingly popular.
And I've noticed that a lot of restaurants are like adding those to their dishes now too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might have a dish that's served with a fermented sauce or a fermented condiment,
Okay.
or you might have a dessert that incorporates a fermented ingredient.
That's really interesting.
There are all sorts of ways to kind of get creative with fermentation and to add a really unique and interesting flavor profile to your dishes.
Now, here's something that I thought was kind of surprising, that he mentioned, and that's the significance of home cooking. I feel like that kind of goes against what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you would think that with all these new trends and all this technology, that home cooking would be kind of on the decline.
Right.
But Maurice actually sees it as being more important than ever.
So why is that?
Well, he attributes it to a couple of factors. One is the economy. As food prices continue to rise,
Right.
people are looking for ways to save money, and cooking at home is obviously a more affordable option than eating out all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think people are just more interested in cooking now.
Yeah, I think there's a real kind of resurgence of interest in cooking and in knowing where your food comes from.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really positive trend.
So how can restaurants kind of capitalize on that trend? I mean, it seems like they're kind of competing with home cooks in a way.
Well, I think the key is to not see it as competition, but rather as an opportunity to engage with your customers.
Okay.
And Maurice suggests a few different ways to do this. One is to offer cooking classes,
Oh, that's cool.
where you can teach your customers how to prepare some of your signature dishes.
Yeah, that would be really fun.
Yeah, it's a great way to build community, to share your expertise,
Yeah.
and to create a more loyal customer base.
And I've also seen some restaurants doing like meal kits now where they send you like,
Oh yeah, the meal kits are huge right now, and that's another great way to kind of tap into this trend.
yeah, and they send you like all the ingredients you need and the instructions.
Exactly. It's like having a restaurant quality meal, but you get to prepare it yourself at home.
That's really cool. Now, let's talk about exoticism.
Yeah.
I love trying new foods and new cuisine. So what's happening in that world?
Well, Maurice has a really interesting perspective on this. He talks about reimagining exoticism. And what he means by that is that the way we think about exotic food is changing.
Okay.
It's no longer just about eating food from faraway countries. It's about seeking out authentic and sustainable new taste experiences.
So it's less about like, the novelty of it and more about like the authenticity of the experience.
Exactly. It's about understanding the culture and the history behind the food and appreciating the unique flavors and ingredients that each region has to offer.
So what are some examples of that?
Well, one example that Maurice gives is the popularity of Hawaiian poke bars.
Oh yeah, I love poke.
Yeah, poke is a great example of how you can take a traditional dish and and give it a modern twist.
Yeah, and it's so healthy too.
Yeah, it's a very healthy and flavorful dish,
Yeah.
and it's really kind of taken off in recent years.
Yeah.
And then another example is the increasing use of South American ingredients like acai and guarana.
Okay.
These are ingredients that were once considered to be very exotic, but now they're becoming increasingly mainstream.
So it's like the definition of exotic is constantly evolving.
Exactly. What was once considered exotic is now becoming familiar, and so we're always looking for new and exciting flavors to explore.
Now, finally, I want to touch on something we talked about earlier, which is flexitarianism. It seems like that's still a really strong trend.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Flexitarianism is here to stay, and Marie sees it as being one of the most important trends shaping the future of food.
And why is that?
Well, it's really driven by a number of factors. We talked about the health concerns, the environmental concerns, the ethical concerns, and all of these things are leading people to reduce their meat consumption.
Okay.
And to incorporate more plant-based foods into their diets.
So what does that mean for restaurants?
Well, it means that you need to be offering more flexitarian options on your menu. You need to have dishes that are appealing to both meat eaters and non-meat eaters.
So it's not just about having like a separate vegetarian menu. It's about integrating those options into your main menu.
Exactly. You want to create a menu that's inclusive and that has something for everyone.
So to kind of sum up all these trends that we've been talking about, it seems like 2025 is going to be a really exciting year for the culinary world.
It is. It's going to be a year of innovation and creativity and I think it's going to be a really great time to be in the food and beverage industry.
Yeah. And, I think Reese makes a really good point about how these trends are not just about food. They're about creating experiences for your customers. They're about telling a story and about connecting with people on a deeper level.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, as you're thinking about how to implement these trends in your own business.
So just to quickly recap, Reese, a hospitality professional who really knows this industry inside and out, specializes in food and beverage management and sales. He's really kind of laid out, these trends that are coming in 2025. We're looking at a blend of, the traditional and the new, the self-produced food movement, this whole technological revolution.
Yeah, restoration.
Restoration, yeah. Changing ideas about protein, the revival of fermentation, home cooking, reimagined exoticism and flexitarianism. Like, it's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's exciting stuff. And I think the message here is that there's a huge opportunity for anyone who's willing to embrace these trends and be creative and think outside the box.
Now, the big question Maurice leaves us with is, are you ready to kind of take on this challenge and really reinvent your cuisine to attract the foodies of tomorrow?
Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity. To really create something special and to really stand out from the competition.
And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
Thinking about all these different trends we've talked about.
Yeah.
Whether it's incorporating those new protein sources, the technology, using fermentation, engaging with those home cooks, experimenting with different cuisines, catering to the flexitarians. Which one of these do you think is like the biggest opportunity for your specific hotel or restaurant?
It's a great question to consider.
Yeah, and think about, what would make the biggest impact for you in the coming year.
Yeah, where can you really make a difference and set yourself apart?
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
We'll see you next time.